Okay, today's lecture is going to be kind of short. We talked about migration last time and some of the pretty amazing feats of annual migration that birds will make, typically, again, moving north to south between breeding grounds and non-breeding grounds. And today's lecture is going to focus on some of the proximate mechanisms associated with how they accomplish that. So how do they actually navigate during this process that makes migration possible? Well, we kind of briefly talked about this example during the last lecture too, the displacement experiment with the white-crowned sparrows, where they showed that they have some pretty remarkable abilities to understand where they are on the planet and change their migration paths with some pretty amazing navigational abilities. So in this case, they took some wintering white-crowned sparrows in California and moved some of them to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and others to the Banning Lab in Maryland. And they were able to make it back to their breeding ground. And birds like this sometimes show, as I mentioned, remarkable sight fidelity and can, year after year, show up to the same just a few meters of ground. So how do they actually accomplish this? Well, if you're going to navigate, you need two things minimally. You have to have some concept of where you are and where other things are spaced in the landscape, so a map concept. And then have some directionality, so that's where a compass comes into play. So as far as the map goes, birds do use major landmarks like rivers and valleys and coastlines and mountain ranges and can understand the relative positioning of these. Raptors famously can funnel down Central America, following that landmass and chasing thermals as they're migrating diurnally. So a map concept is fairly kind of easy to understand what's going on, but what are the ways that birds can sense direction, north, south, east, and west? So that's when we have to talk about various compass mechanisms. Well, let's first talk about the sun compass. Some birds can use the relative position of the sun to understand north, south, east, and west. So in this one study, just to demonstrate that they could do this, caged starlings, which would demonstrate a Zuganru at appropriate times, would show Zuganru in this one kind of, if this was kind of indicating, let me get a pen going here. If this was indicating, say, north, south, this is not that easy without a mouse, east and west, then these birds basically were kind of attempting to migrate northwest, and they were orienting in that direction. Now they can do this if they were exposed to the sun and could actually see the sun's location at the appropriate time of day. On cloudy days, though, this is what they did. I mean, just total random. They couldn't orient correctly on cloudy days. Pigeons, when they're trying to navigate from a release site back to their home, they tend to get there faster. If they can see the sun on sunny days, they tend to navigate more successfully. So there's some anecdotal evidence that they're doing this, but they've done some really cool studies to demonstrate this more thoroughly. Because here's one of the big challenges associated with a sun compass. You can't just look at the sun and know what direction things are if you don't also know what time of day it is. So birds have to be able to compensate for the time of day and understand where the sun should be at that time of day. So this picture right here, I took, that actually happened to be a sunrise, but who knows? You know, if you didn't know the time of day, that could easily have been a sunset. So here was a cool study in which they had birds trained to fly out from a home roost in the morning. And they trained them to go to this feeding site where there was a nice stable food supply for them north every morning. So the birds were trained to do that. And they did that at sunrise. And so imagine you're a bird being released from this site, and you say, okay, well, the sun's over that direction, so I'm going to face the sun, and I need to fly to my left. Okay, that would put them flying north. But what the researchers did is then they shifted the circadian rhythm of these birds back 6 hours relative to the true sunlight. So their circadian rhythms were shifted such that they thought noon was morning. So noon, so it's kind of like they're getting lazy and sleeping in late, and they're basically waking up at noon because of this shift. Well, that changes their expectation. Well, their expectation is going to be the same about the relative position of the sun, but it's going to change the direction in which they actually think is that appropriate direction. So let's look at that again. If the 6 hour shift has put them where they are at noon, thinking that it's morning, where is the sun at that time period? Well, it's basically overhead, but usually it's shifted a little south, particularly in the wintertime. And so they look at that and they go, oh, okay, well, there's the sun. Again, I'm going to face the sun, and I'm going to fly to my left. Okay, so that 6 hour shift has caused a 90 degree change in the direction that they're going to fly. So now they think that south is east because that is where it appears the sun is rising. And so instead of flying north, what they think is north is actually east. And so they're flying in that direction. So it may take you a little while to kind of figure what's going on here. But what this is demonstrating, this study is demonstrating that they are tying what they think the time is to their expectation of where the sun is to understand the relative positions in a compass sense. So the sun compass is used by some birds, but remember I mentioned that most passerines are nocturnal migrants, and so it's clear that they use a star or stellar compass. And they're not actually looking at a specific star or a specific constellation, but they're looking at movements of constellations around a central point that isn't moving, and that's the North Star. And some of the ingenious ways that this has been studied has used birds in really low-tech situations where you can expose them to the night sky in these cages, and you put them in buckets. But in these buckets, they're standing on these ink pads. And the buckets have funnels that are in there. And the birds, when they're demonstrating Zuganru, if this bird is trying to fly and jumping, showing that migratory restlessness in this direction, it's going to stain this blotting paper that lines this funnel a dark color. Okay, so this basically, you can look at how dark this patch is to determine the basic propensity of the vectors in which this bird is trying to fly while it's demonstrating Zuganru. So it's a pretty ingenious but cheap an effective way of quantifying the directionality associated with their Zuganru. So as I mentioned, you could actually do this by exposing birds to the night sky so that they can actually see the stars. But you could also put them in a planetarium and show that they will react in appropriate ways if you change the star patterns. And so this was a study using indigo buntings, and indigo buntings was the previous study I mentioned using the funnels. And this first A is a situation where that's what the birds would normally be orienting to at the time of the study under a normal night sky, if they could actually see the sky. B is the pattern of the same birds looking at the star pattern displayed in a planetarium. So you can see that they really are looking at it like it is the true stars. That means if you rotate things 180 degrees so that the North Star is now in the south and the constellations are spinning around that, albeit slowly, you can trick the birds into thinking that south is now north. They think it is north. And then if you give them a blank sky or random patterns of movements of stars, you see that you can completely disorient the birds in these planetarium studies. And it's not that they're specifically looking at specific star patterns or constellations. You can actually trick indigo buntings into paying attention to other constellations if you make them center around a different star that is the center point that's not moving. So again, North Star is usually not moving. The constellations will be moving around that, as is shown here in A. But if you use Betelgeuse instead, and you simply take the constellations associated with that and move them around that central point, which you can do in a planetarium, you see that you get the same behaviors as if it was the North Star for these buntings. A third type of compass seen in some birds is the magnetic compass, where birds can actually sense the magnetic poles associated with the north and southern poles of the planet. And what they're actually sensing are what are called the dip angles. The dip angles can be seen associated with this graphic. See where these arrows are leaving the north and the south, they are coming off fairly straight, but as they get closer and closer to the equator, you see that there's an angle, a specific angle associated with that departure from that magnetic wave. Well, birds can actually sense what that angle is, and it doesn't, give them any idea of kind of the longitude that they're at, but it can give them a sense of where they are latitudinally. So, if birds can do this, how can we demonstrate this capability in studies? Well, one of the things that they've done is they've taken European robins during migration and put them in steel cages where you can reverse the magnetic fields, again, make north-south and south-north. Excuse me. And what happens is, again, you get the predictable pattern. If they would normally be showing Zuganru north, they would switch that to south. So I've kind of been presenting these compasses as if birds have one or the other. And actually they can have backup. They can have maybe one that's a primary, but they can use another compass source as a backup set of information. This has been demonstrated with pigeons, where the sun is clearly their primary compass, but on cloudy days they can actually fall back to the magnetic compass as a way to navigate, to basically sense, north, south, east, and west. In this case, not necessarily paying attention to the latitudinal position I was mentioning earlier. So, I mean, this sense of understanding where you are on the planet with a magnetic compass does give you a general sense also of north, south, east, and west. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to indicate that wasn't the case. So let's look at this study where they gave pigeons an attachment of either a little brass ingot or a magnet. On sunny days, it didn't matter which one they had. They were able to navigate in the appropriate direction, in this case, south. And the dots here show kind of the range of individuals. The mean direction is indicated by the direction of this arrow and how long that arrow is. And so it's a pretty tight movement pattern here. Clearly got some losers over here, but for the most part, they did a fairly good job. And there's really no difference between these groups. However, on overcast days, look at what happens to those that are carrying the magnet. I guess the mean is still going basically south, but clearly they're just lost. They don't know which way they're going because they can't see the sun and understand the relative position of the sun to know what south is, but they also can't back up their magnetic polarity sensations. But the ones with the brass can, because brass isn't messing up their sense of the magnetic field. So basically the brass ingots were just an experimental control in this setting. Similar studies have looked at using Helmholtz coils wrapped around the heads in little hats that they carry, where you can control the direction of current to either duplicate or replicate the typical north, south, east, west patterns. Or you could reverse them, and so make north, south, and south, north. And again, on sunny days, it doesn't matter. If you're training them to go north, they're pretty much going north. But on overcast days, what you see is that we have different directions in which the birds are trying to fly. And clearly there's a lot of noise here too. The birds are pretty much confused in both cases, but they're more likely to be able to fly in the correct direction on an overcast days with a counterclockwise current, because that is replicating the natural magnetic fields. Here, they're getting conflicting information, right? Well, actually, on the overcast days, they're really getting the wrong information. The information is saying go south because we've altered the polarity of the fields that they're sensing, but they can't see the sun, and so they're really not paying attention. I mentioned previously that the sun was their primary compass mechanism, and this is the study to demonstrate that, right? Because up here, just right above that, the clockwise current that really is saying, no, this is south. No, they're saying, no, that's north, because I can see where the sun is. So they're ignoring the magnetic sense in this case. They're sort of paying attention to it here, but they're still pretty lost. So magnetism, again, can give you a sense of where you are latitudinally, and this is very important in bobolinks. Pardon me again. They make these really incredibly 20,000 kilometer round trip migrations between North America and Argentina. And it's been shown that they have magnetic sensitive structures in the photopigments of their eye, and also magnetite in their upper bill that may help them understand this navigational field directionality. Lastly, there are two other potential compass mechanisms that have been shown to exist in some birds. Environmental odors can give birds like pigeons a general sense of where they are. And this has been called a compass. This to me is more almost like an odor map. It may not give them true directionality, but it more indicates. So like if you raise some pigeons, say in East Texas, and you release them in Austin area, under the appropriate conditions, they could potentially smell the pine forest of East Texas and use that to navigate back home, using that kind of degree of an odor compass. But again, to me, it's more kind of a relative of a map concept. But the data on this, there have been studies that have tried to replicate this, and they have not always been consistent. There may be geographic variation in different populations of pigeons that are capable of doing it and others not. But the data are not completely consistent on how good their abilities are. Birds can see polarized light and use this compass at least at certain times of the day. This figure here shows you what happens at sunrise and sunset. There is a band of polarized light that runs north-south at both sunrise and sunset. And again, most passerines are going to be taking off, getting underway for migration about that time. And so that would give them initial starting points. Okay, there's north or there's south before they start flying. Again, this isn't going to be, it's going to be limited in its availability just during those brief periods of sunrise and sunset. All right, relatively brief lecture today. We're going to talk about nesting and nesting biology next time, and that's going to be a bit longer. I may break it up into two lectures, but that's what you're going to be getting later in this week. So everybody stay healthy out there. Again, if you're having trouble getting out to the lab assignments, talk to me and we'll figure out a way to handle that. All right, cheers.